Welcome back. Today in Module 4, we're going to look at the important decade after the conclusion of the French and Indian War and leading up to the first shots in Concord and Lexington, and finally in 1776 to the Declaration of Independence. Before we begin, I'd just like you to look briefly at this map of the United Kingdom as it exists today. As I mentioned earlier in the course, we are using the terms Britain and England interchangeably, but actually it's much more complicated. You don't really need to know, for the purpose of this course, all the details, but for your general interest, you should realize the outer circle there, the blue diagram, are referred to as the British Isles. And within the British Isles, you have on the lower left the island of Ireland, and the southern two-thirds of it is the independent country, the Republic of Ireland, which became independent in the early 1920s. And then Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, which consists of Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And technically, Great Britain consists of what you see within the yellow oval there, which is England, Wales, and Scotland. Again, you don't need to know all the details of that, and for the purposes of this course, I'm going to again use England and Britain interchangeably. And what is now the independent country of the Republic of Ireland was part of what I call in this course Britain or England. So, at the conclusion of the French and Indian War, which you recall was ended by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, we had the situation where Britain took French territory up to the Mississippi River. However, there was an uprising of Indians called Pontiac's Rebellion near the Great Lakes area. The British government, having withdrawn most of its troops from North America after the end of the French and Indian War, did not want to have further hostilities with the Indians. So the king in 1763 prohibited British colonists in North America to travel essentially to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. And you can see on this map that is the red line, which is referred to as the Proclamation Line of 1763. So even though Britain had obtained the territory from the Appalachian Mountains all the way over to the Mississippi River, for practical reasons, the king prohibited colonists from moving west into the fertile farmland. Now, it's important to understand that this was the first time the king and British Parliament had prohibited the colonists from moving westward. Britain didn't have soldiers along that line. There was no fence. There was no real demarcation. And so British colonists, long accustomed to governing themselves, just simply moved west of the line and ignored the British government. Now, following the conclusion of the French and Indian War, as we looked at in the last lecture, the British government was deeply in debt, and there was a widely held view in Britain that the colonists living in North America should pay more taxes on the grounds that the war was for their benefit. And the debt was so much that the British government's interest payments on its debt was half the government budget, and that was just the interest payment without paying down the principal. So Britain imposed the Sugar Act, which was a tax on imported French sugar and molasses, which the colonists in North America used to make rum, which was one of their favorite beverages. They also passed a Quartering Act, which required colonists to accept British soldiers in their private homes. The Quartering Act was of particular significance because you'll recall that during the French and Indian War, the British government had imposed this similar requirement on the colonists at a time when they had around 25,000 British regular soldiers in the colonies, as well as a number of civilian British officials. Following the war, the vast majority of those soldiers returned to Britain, in fact, virtually all of them. However, following the war, many colonists engaged in smuggling, and we had what was the breakdown of the mercantilist system. You'll recall that mercantilism was the colonial system used by Britain and all the other European colonial powers, which required that the colonies trade exclusively with the mother country. But now the colonists were engaged in widespread smuggling and illegal trade with French colonies in the Caribbean, with France itself, and with other countries. Many colonists also engaged in local manufacturing, which was prohibited under the system of mercantilism. So the British wanted to reduce smuggling, so they moved soldiers into the ports to ensure that the ships were only carrying products from Britain, as well as some soldiers and sailors along the coast to try and reduce the smuggling. After the French and Indian War, which we'll see in this course is typical of after every major military conflict, there was an economic depression. The essential reason is wartime activities often greatly aid an economy because the government buys more uniforms, there are more soldiers, purchasing uniforms, everything from boots to the uniforms themselves, weapons. After the war, as there was a transition from a military to a civilian economy, there was economic depression. Colonists protested the depressed economic conditions, and at this time, they really began their first debate on the role of the British Parliament in the colonies. In 1765, only 2 years after the end of the French and Indian War, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which was designed to raise revenue in the British colonies to help Britain pay the huge debt it had incurred in the French and Indian War, and also to assert the all-important principle of parliamentary sovereignty vis-a-vis the colonies. In other words, the British Parliament in London, even though it had no representatives from the colonies, had the right to impose taxes. Now, this is the first direct tax on the colonists. This is not a tax on trade. By a direct tax, we mean a tax, for instance, today on income. Income tax we all pay is a direct tax. Every time we buy a product in the stores, virtually every product except unprocessed food and medicine, we now pay a sales tax of around 8%. So the Stamp Act was something similar. This was a tax imposed on the purchase of any paper products, and the tax was paid to the British government, which had an official in the colonies put a stamp on each piece of paper. And it wasn't a stamp that glued to the paper like our modern postage stamps, but rather it was a stamp, like a rubber stamp. It was a metal plate engraved in which they put an ink and put it on every piece of newspaper, even plain cards. Now, the colonists strongly disagreed and said Parliament in London did not have the right to impose direct taxes, and only their local assemblies in the colonies had that right. This is a view of the actual stamp that was used. This piece of metal is engraved, and the Stamp Act, the stamp agent would cover it with ink and put it on each page of paper. As part of this protest, see on the next slide, a group was set up in Boston called the Sons of Liberty. And this is not a real person being hung by their neck, but rather an effigy or of a person. And they hung this up outside the house of a British official who was acting as a Stamp Act collector as a warning. And they called the tree the Liberty Tree. Needless to say, the Stamp Act collector himself, as well as his family, were quite upset, and they voluntarily returned to Britain. No taxation without representation, a phrase that we all have heard before, became much of the rallying cry of those who opposed to the Stamp Act. Now, we're well before independence. At this point, really no one in the colonies is talking about independence from Britain. The colonists still view themselves as loyal British subjects living on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. But the imposition of direct taxation through the Stamp Act united all of the colonists at this point, because there was a fundamental assumption of the whites in England that they would not be taxed without representation. For its part, the British Parliament argued that they had the right to impose these taxes because the British Parliament, by its very nature, represented all British subjects of the king, whether they resided in England or overseas. In reaction to the imposition of the Stamp Act, the colonists got together for the first time. And remember, the colonists at this point viewed themselves more as inhabitants of a certain colony. For instance, they would identify themselves with Virginia, New York, or Pennsylvania. But they sent representatives to get together to protest the Stamp Act. They did readily acknowledge that Parliament had authority over the colonies. They acknowledged that they were loyal to the king, but they denied that Parliament had the right to impose such taxes. Now, this happened over 200 years ago, and a question we should all consider: is this still relevant in the United States today? Is there anywhere in the United States today where people are born there, they become U.S. citizens, they are required by law to pay the same taxes you and I pay here in the Houston area? In other words, pay federal income tax, pay mandatory Social Security, Medicare today, and of course, local sales tax. Well, the next slide we'll see where that is. Washington, D.C. The District of Columbia, of course, is not one of the 50 states. It's a federal district. And this is the license plate, which is on every car in Washington, D.C. These license plates are issued by the local government in Washington, D.C., and every license plate has on the bottom taxation without representation. This is a form of protest against the fact that the residents of Washington, D.C., while United States citizens and subject to the same obligations to pay taxes, are not represented in Congress. All 50 states have representatives in the U.S. Congress, 2 senators for each state, as we know, and number of representatives depends on the population of each state. However, Washington, D.C. has no voting representatives in Congress. They do have observers. They have no representation. In the 1960s, the U.S. Constitution was amended to allow residents of Washington, D.C. to have a say in presidential elections. And so currently, the District of Columbia has 3 electoral votes when determining the president, and that would be as if they were a state with 2 senators and 1 representative. Another question is an incorporated territory such as Puerto Rico, which you can see in this map. It's in the center of this map, island in the Caribbean, a former Spanish colony, and you'll learn in History 1302 how the United States acquired Puerto Rico after the war with Spain in 1898. People born in Puerto Rico are automatically U.S. citizens, but do not have the obligation to pay taxes, as do residents of the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. And there's no real movement in Puerto Rico to protest that, because Puerto Ricans enjoy all the rights and privileges of U.S. citizens. For instance, you can travel from Puerto Rico to the United States, work in the United States, live in the mainland United States. You could even go to United States universities, state universities, at in-state residence. So some residents of Puerto Rico do want to become an independent country. Others want to become a state. And every few years, there is a referendum in Puerto Rico to ask the residents what they would prefer. And at this point, the majority prefer their current status. Well, the outrage over the imposition of the Stamp Act led the colonists to organize themselves as colonists for the first time, and they decided to boycott English goods. They refused to purchase imported English goods to the extent possible, and this was motivated both by patriotism and also by self-interest of those who produced competing products. For instance, if you were a small manufacturer and you were illegally making plows for farmers, which you weren't not allowed to do because as a colonist you weren't allowed to produce the same products that were produced in the mother country, well, you would want people not to buy British plows so you could sell your plows. People also refused to purchase paper with stamps on it. And this affected British trade, and so Parliament backed down, and in the so-called Declaratory Act, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but Parliament reiterated that it had the right to raise taxes in the colonies. Now, obviously, the colonists were delighted with this victory, and it showed the colonists that by getting together and applying economic pressure on Britain, they could get Britain to change its policies. However, shortly thereafter, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which, rather than levying a direct tax as the Stamp Act, increased import duties on English products, or rather, for the first time imposed import duties on English products. Now, no longer are we talking about French rum or molasses, but English products, and this included paper and tea. They also passed another quartering act because the British were sending over more soldiers and more customs officials to enforce the application of this law in the ports. This led to much hostile resistance. Here we have an imaginary sticker or poster showing a colonist reading about the new tax on tea, and in the background we have a British soldier at the port to ensure that the colonists comply with the law. Now we have a massive boycott of English goods. The colonists quite naturally decided that their previous boycott after the Stamp Act had led to the repeal of the Stamp Act, so now they increased their efforts not to buy English goods, hoping that would lead to the repeal of the Townshend Acts. And for the first time, we really see the women involved in the protest movement. Many women decided that rather than buy clothes from Britain, that they would make them in the colonies. So women started spinning the yarn to make cloth, and then they sewed the cloth together to make clothes. Many of the clothes were not attractive because these women were not professional seamstresses or dress designers. But it became a badge of honor, a mark of honor, to wear clothes that didn't look good, but they were clearly homemade. And this was called wearing homespun clothing. Homespun means that they spun the cloth at home, and this became, a political statement. And so you had very wealthy women who previously had worn imported fashions from Europe, now wearing very poorly designed and poorly made homemade clothing. Here we just have a drawing from the time showing women spinning the cloth, weaving it, and making clothing. The Boston Massacre occurred when unarmed colonists confronted a group of British soldiers in Boston, and there was a verbal confrontation, and there are various accounts of what actually happened, but the most important thing is that the fact that the British troops, one or two of them panicked, they were poorly disciplined, and started shooting at the unarmed British colonists. Several British colonists were killed, and this became quickly known as the Boston Massacre. And what you see here is a very famous drawing that was done the day after, and it was quickly circulated in all the newspapers in the major cities in the colonies. And this became a real symbol or rallying cry for the colonists, particularly the phrase massacre. You see the British troops lined up and shooting into the unarmed colonists. In reality, the British troops were not lined up, they were poorly disciplined, and the colonists were throwing heavy rocks and bricks at the soldiers, which of course did not justify the killing of the colonists. But this drawing, which was done by Paul Revere, whom we'll see a little later, a Boston silversmith, produced great emotion throughout the colonies. Well, in London, the King and Parliament were very upset to hear about the Boston Massacre, because here we have British troops killing British citizens who weren't armed. And so Britain repealed the Townshend Acts, but left the tax on tea to preserve the principle that Parliament and the British government had the right to tax the policies, tax the colonists. And it's important to note that the tax that they left on tea was a very small tax. And in fact, it was cheaper to buy British tea with the tax than to buy smuggled tea from other countries. At this point, the colonists realized that they needed to keep in touch with each other, particularly because there were no national communication. The newspapers were not, there were no national newspapers. This is before the age of the telegraph. And so they decided to regularly have correspondence or letters from selected individuals in each colony just to let other colonists know what was happening. So they set up the so-called committees of correspondence, which was just letter writing among representatives from the colonies who had previously met at the Stamp Act Congress. Now the British government passed the Tea Act, and this was just confirming that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. Again, it was a low tax, but what we're talking about here is principle. Well, the colonists in Boston were outraged, or a number of them, and they had the infamous Boston Tea Party. This was in December 1773, where a crowd gathered on the docks. Some of the men dressed up as Indians. It was quite clear they weren't Indians. Everyone knew they weren't Indians, but they put some Indian clothing on. They went on the boats and they threw the wooden crates of tea into the ocean. The water entered the crates, ruining the tea. And this was a very, very expensive product. The cargo on the several boats they boarded was very, very valuable cargo. And they had a big party and thought it was great fun. Well, as soon as Parliament in London heard about this, and of course it took several weeks for news to cross the Atlantic, they were outraged that the colonists had destroyed this property and they were not respecting the law that required a taxation on tea. So Parliament passed what it called the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they were called the Intolerable Acts because the colonists said they wouldn't tolerate them. The British Navy and officials completely closed the port of Boston. Soldiers were sent over and prohibited anyone, even fishermen, from leaving the port of Boston. And this was done on the assumption that the problem in the North American colonies was not throughout the colonies, but rather restricted to Boston and Massachusetts. Parliament took away all the power of the colonies' assembly and transferred it to the royal governor of Massachusetts. Another act of the Coercive Acts was to allow royal officials stationed in North America to stand trial in London, not locally. And finally, yet another quartering act, because in order to enforce these new prohibitions, the British government had to send more soldiers and officials to Boston and the surrounding area, and they needed a place to stay, so colonists would be required to house and feed these British officials. Well, this led to the convening of the First Continental Congress, and this was in Philadelphia with representatives from the colonies. And they met, and they didn't meet initially to declare independence. To the contrary, they wanted to improve relations with Britain. And as they were meeting, the famous battles of Lexington and Concord occurred, and these were, of course, later realized to be the first shots in the Revolutionary War. Lexington and Concord were two small villages outside of Boston. Some of the colonist activists there were storing weapons, cannons, and gunpowder in case there was going to be a confrontation with the British. The British heard about this through their network of spies, sent troops towards Lexington and Concord. The colonists heard about that, and this is where Paul Revere had his famous ride. Paul Revere was one of the so-called Minutemen who was prepared to fight the British troops if necessary. and he saw that the British troops were moving out of Boston, so he and others rode their horses and screamed, the British are coming, the British are coming. So in the first encounter, the colonists lined up in the classic European fashion of rows, and you can see in this painting in front of them are the rows of highly trained and effective British troops. And this was a major disaster for the colonists because the British troops were much better trained, and so the colonists quickly retreated. However, as the British marched to Lexington and Concord, they removed as much as they could of the rifles and ammunition from the barns, and instead of fighting in the classic European way, the colonists would climb trees and shoot down on the British. They would hide individually behind rocks or trees and shoot what today we call more, guerrilla type of warfare. The British were shocked at this. They thought this was uncivilized and barbarian. And of course, the colonists all knew how to shoot their weapons very well because many of them hunted on the weekends and whatnot, and they were expert marksmen. They also had more accurate rifles because the barrels were longer and they could actually shoot more accurately at a distance than the British. So the colonists engaged in what the British considered barbaric and uncivilized warfare, and this was particularly deadly for the British as they retreated to Boston because the officers insisted the British troops in the bright red uniforms march in nice formations down the small roads with drums beating, which of course announced where they were, and many of them were killed before they returned to Boston. Well, this is in the spring of 1775, over a year before the Declaration of Independence. So after Boston and Lexington, it was the Second Continental Congress, which again did not declare independence. The situation with Britain was clearly deteriorating. And the delegates at the Second Continental Congress, again in Philadelphia, said that they were taking action to uphold their rights as British citizens, and they had these rights under the British Constitution. This is Independence Hall in Philadelphia where the delegates met. So Thomas Paine, who had recently arrived from England, wrote a very important brochure, or today we call it pamphlet at this time, and the title was Common Sense. He wrote this for a mass audience. Many colonists at this point, white colonists, could read. Normally, political documents were written for the elite with many phrases in Latin, but Thomas Paine decided to write this for a mass audience, so the common working person could read it in a coffee house or a bar, or have someone read it to him. And in this document, he said that King George III was a royal brute, and that that birth as an aristocrat should not confer any privileges, and it was totally revolutionary because he totally rejected the concept of the divine right of kings. And he really, for the first time, urged American colonists to establish their own country. He said the time has come for independence. There is no longer any hope for us in the colonies to continue as British subjects, but we must establish our own country. Here we have a portrait of Thomas Paine. Now, the Declaration of Independence was written in the summer of 1776, and it really didn't have any new ideas, so it was readily accepted by most colonists. Why did they write a Declaration of Independence? Well, it was written at this point largely because the colonists realized that in a major military confrontation with Britain, they would not be able to win. They needed outside assistance, and they wanted the French to assist. So the Declaration of Independence was really written more with the idea of the French government reading it and the French government coming to the assistance of the colonists. And as we'll see when we look at the actual revolution, it took several years for the French government to decide to assist the revolutionaries. And you have to remember here that the French government at the time was ruled by a king, and Thomas Paine and the other colonists were saying they no longer accepted the right of kings to rule. And as we discussed in the last lecture, in the draft Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson cited John Locke's social contract and the theory of natural rights. It was approved on July 2nd, 1776, but made public on July 4th, 1776, and that, of course, is why July 4th is celebrated as Independence Day. This is the actual Declaration of Independence, which is a relatively short document, and you can see the original of this in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And it's quite interesting to just see the second line, the unanimous declaration of the United and then States of America is capitalized. At this time, the states viewed themselves as more important than some unified entity, but they realized they had to come together. And we saw in the last module on the Declaration of Independence was based on John Locke's theory of social contract, that the people made a social contract with the government. The people agreed to give up some of their rights, but the government had the right to protect their natural rights, life, liberty, and property. And if the government failed to serve its citizens, then they, the citizens, have the right to rebel. And this, of course, is the basis for independence. And we can see it here. We saw this in the last class. The Declaration of Independence drew very, very heavily on John Locke's theory of social contract. It's interesting to note that this same phrasing in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence was used by many, many other countries in Latin America in the early 1800s when they declared independence from Spain and Portugal, and in 1945 when Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh issued a Declaration of Independence from France, because Vietnam had been, of course, a French colony, and it used exactly the same words as the U.S. Declaration of Independence, first paragraph. So here we have, subsequent to the issuance of the Declaration of Independence, a group of colonists in New York City pulling down the statue of King George, and that statue was actually melted down and made into cannonballs, and which were used in the War for Independence. So here we are at the end of this lecture. Where are we? We have independence has just been declared. There has been some fighting for over a year, and the colonists are divided. Roughly 1/3 of the colonists remain neutral. Historians disagree whether it's 25, 30, 35%, but for all purposes, we'll just say roughly 1/3 remained neutral. They just wanted to get on with their lives, their business, their farm, whatever. Others supported the king. These are the loyalists, roughly 1/3. They feared chaos. They were loyal British. Or they may have benefited economically from remaining a colony. For instance, people in some of the big ports like New York or Boston, their business might depend on importing British products and selling them, or exporting American agricultural products. And as for the free blacks, well, many of them read the words of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's words about equality, and they thought that that would mean that they would have equality with whites, because anyone reading that would assume that, and we'll talk much more about that later as we go along in the course. Others sided with the British, particularly some slaves, not many, but some, we'll see later, because during the war, as the war drug on, the British told some slaves, well, if we win, you'll have freedom. And significantly fewer than half the colonists supported independence. Again, roughly a third. Sometimes it was for principle, no taxation without representation, etc., etc. Sometimes for economic reasons. Someone wanted to trade with France or Spain and not have to go through Britain, or someone wanted to manufacture plows or some other simple product in North America. They weren't allowed. So what we have is, while we have a war for independence, the American Revolution, which we'll be looking at in detail in the next module, in a sense, we also have a civil war, because we have the colonists divided, and there was actually some violence between those fighting for independence and those who wanted to remain with the king. Thank you.